His name was Frank Doherty. He was 38 years old, and he worked a stretch of limestone country on the south bank of the Llano River in Llano County, Texas, a place where the live oaks grew low and stubborn along the granite ridges, and the hill country sky went on in every direction like something that had never heard the word boundary. The land was not gentle. The soil ran thin over caliche, the summers were merciless, and the Llano River, for all its beauty running clear over its limestone bed, could rise in a single night after a hill country storm and take fences, animals, and months of labor downstream without ceremony. Frank had learned all of this the hard way. He had learned most things the hard way. He had been on this ground since he was 19, when his father died of a chest complaint and left him the place with no formal occasion beyond a handshake that turned out to be the last one. He had built the stone barn himself, one limestone course at a time, the summer he turned 23. He had run cattle through drought, flood, and one early freeze that took a third of the herd, and had come through all of it the way the cedars came through August heat. Not gracefully, without stopping. People in Llano knew Frank Doherty the way they knew a landmark, not the kind of man who made speeches or spent evenings at the saloon on Bessemer Avenue, the kind who showed up when a neighbor's fence came down in a flood, who paid his debts before they were asked for, who said what he meant and nothing more. He had lived alone on this land for 11 years and had not once given it serious thought to change that. His cousin Wade Doherty was 2 years his senior and built differently in every way that counted. Wade had the grandfather's easy manner, wide smile, storyteller's timing, the settled certainty that things generally worked themselves out. He ran the family's second parcel 3 miles north along the river. Not a bad man, simply a man who too often chose the convenient thing over the correct one. The letter came on a Wednesday. Frank knew it was Wednesday because he had just finished resetting the capstone on the south pasture wall, a limestone block that had been working loose since the spring rains, and his hands were white with rock dust when Wade rode up the gate road waving an envelope like the way he always waved things, like whatever he was carrying deserved a ceremony. "She's coming," Wade said. "Rebecca McPherson, noon stage from San Antonio, next Friday." He handed Frank the letter without being asked. Frank read it with limestone dust on his fingers and left 2 prints on the corner. She wrote plainly, no flourishes, no excess. She gave the date, the stage line, and the hope that arrangements would be in order. She was 24. Had kept house for her father in Tennessee until his death the previous spring. Signed it, R. McPherson. Frank handed it back. "He sounds sensible," he said. Wade grinned. "Sounds like exactly what a man needs out here." Frank went back to his capstone. What he didn't say, what he said to no one, was that he had seen the advertisement before Wade placed it, had held the draft in his own hands while his cousin asked him to check the spelling, and had stood in that kitchen for 2 full minutes reading the kind of life being described, thinking quietly and without any right to the thought that it sounded like a life worth having. He had corrected one misspelling. He handed it back. He did not think about R. McPherson again until the following Friday. On Friday, he thought of little else. Friday came the way Fridays did on a working ranch, head down and too full of labor to feel like anything but another day. Frank had been on the barn roof before the sun cleared the granite ridge east of the river, patching a corner that wept whenever rain came from the north. He heard the San Antonio stage rolling through Llano before noon. He did not come down. He rode north to Wade's place in the early afternoon, telling himself he had no particular reason to hurry. He tied his horse at the post and came around to the porch. Her trunk was already there, set to one side like an afterthought. She was sitting in the straight-backed chair near the window when he stepped inside.
Dark red hair pinned back without vanity, a gray traveling dress that had been neat before the journey and was doing its best to remain so. Green eyes, level and still, that did not move away when you met them. She was perhaps 24, as she had written, with a jaw set just a fraction tighter than it needed to be. The tightness of someone holding themselves carefully together in a room they were not certain about. Wade stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed in the way he crossed them when he had already made a decision and was working out how to say it. Frank stepped in. "Miss McPherson?" She looked at him. "You must be the cousin." Her voice was low and even, Tennessee but worn smooth by some distance from home. "Frank Doherty," he said. She nodded and looked back at Wade. What followed took about 40 minutes. Wade explained with the particular warmth he used when he wanted to cushion a blow without accepting responsibility for it, that he had given the arrangement serious thought and could not in good conscience proceed. He had set aside her return fare to San Antonio. He hoped she'd understand. Rebecca McPherson listened without once interrupting. When Wade finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I understand." 3 words, set down clean as a closed ledger. Frank stood near the threshold and felt something move through him. Not pity. Pity was a simpler thing, something with more weight and more structure. He looked at the woman in the straight-backed chair who was preparing to absorb a situation she had not made, and something in him that had been content to stay quiet made a sound. "Miss McPherson," he said, "would you step outside for a moment?" She looked at him, held the look long enough to take some kind of reading. Then she rose, set her hands at her sides, and walked to the door. Wade said nothing. He had the good sense, for once, to know when a room no longer belonged to him. The porch faced west, and the afternoon light was still high and hard, throwing long shadows from the cedar fence posts across the caliche yard. Rebecca McPherson stood at the railing with her hands loose at her sides, looking out at the hill country the way a person looks at something they are in the process of deciding about. Frank stood a few feet from her and let the silence settle. A scissor-tail flycatcher worked the fence line. Somewhere below the cedar break, the Llano River moved, too far to hear but present in the temperature of the air. After a moment, she spoke first. "The stage back to San Antonio leaves tomorrow morning." Not bitterly, just the fact of it, the way you'd say which way the river ran. "I know," Frank said. She glanced at him sideways. "Is there somewhere I can take a room tonight, in town?" He said, "There's the Llano Hotel on Ford Street." He let a beat pass. "Or you could come south with me. There's a proper room. Door bolts from the inside. I'll take the barn if it would make things easier." She turned to him directly, not alarmed, measuring. "Why?" she said. It was a fair question, and he thought about it honestly before he answered, because that was the only way he knew how to answer things. "Your father died, and you came a long way on the strength of someone else's arrangement," he said. He kept his eyes on the cedar fence line. "You deserve a decent night's rest before you figure out what comes next." He paused. "And I'm not Wade." She was quiet for a moment. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the granite bluff over the river, riding the heated air without once moving its wings. Then she asked, without looking away from the horizon, "Is that all you're offering? One night?" Frank looked at her then. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he has been turning over privately, without permission, without plan, and has finally decided to say out loud. "No," he said. "But I think we ought to get you fed and rested before we talk about the rest of it." Something passed across her face, brief and unclassifiable, gone before he could name it. She said, "All right." She went back inside to get her trunk. Frank went to get his horse and stood there for a moment with his hand on the bridle, looking at the cedar break and telling himself not to think too far ahead. It was harder than it should have been. She stayed. Not with ceremony,
not with a speech. She stayed the way a sensible woman makes a sensible decision, by going to the spare room, setting her trunk against the wall, and appearing at the kitchen table the following morning with the account ledger open in front of her before Frank had drawn his second cup of coffee. She found 2 errors before noon. She put her finger on each without comment, looked at him, looked back down. "How bad?" Frank said. "You've been overcharged by the Llano Grain and Feed 3 seasons running," she said. $22 near enough. He sat with that a moment, then a short laugh came out of him, rough and unpracticed, slightly startling even to himself. She looked up. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, the beginning of one. The stage left for San Antonio without her. The first weeks were a careful negotiation of space and habit. Frank rose before light and worked the land until dark. Rebecca moved through the house with a systematic calm that was nothing like fuss. Every motion at the pace the work wanted, nothing wasted, nothing performed. She reorganized the pantry in a logic Frank couldn't fully explain but could navigate blind within 3 days. She drafted a letter to the Llano Grain and Feed in a hand so precise and argued so cleanly that a credit note arrived inside 10 days. He read the letter twice before she sealed it and said nothing about having done so. What he noticed, working the south pasture that same afternoon, was that the grass along the creek bank was thinner than it should have been for February. The Llano River was running lower than he liked. The sky had the particular pale, washed-out quality that old-timers in the county called a liar's sky, blue and empty and giving nothing away. He did not mention it at supper, but he looked at it again before he came inside, and the looking had a weight to it that he recognized. He had seen dry years before. He knew what they felt like at the start. By April, the drought had a name in Llano County. People spoke it the way they spoke of illness in a family, carefully and not in front of the children. The Llano River dropped another foot. The creek that fed the south pasture went to a trickle and then to a suggestion. The vegetable garden that Rebecca had laid out with such careful precision in late winter began to struggle despite everything she gave it, hauling water from the well twice daily, shading the most vulnerable plants with cut cedar boughs, reading the soil with her fingers every morning, the way a doctor reads a pulse. Frank watched her do this. He was not a man given to watching people as a rule, but he watched her. What he also watched was the sky and the river, and the cattle moving slower in the heat, their ribs beginning to show through their hides in a way that kept him awake in the early hours before dawn, when the land outside felt like something holding its breath. He went inward. He knew he did it, had known it about himself since the freeze of '78, when he had gone 3 weeks without a real conversation and not noticed until afterwards. Under pressure, Frank Doherty went quiet and cold and deep inside himself, the way a creek goes underground in a hard summer. It was not a quality he was proud of. It was simply what happened. Rebecca noticed. He could tell she noticed by the way she began to measure her words at supper, still present, still direct, but watching him the way she watched the garden, checking for what was and wasn't there. One evening she asked him plainly how bad he thought it would get. He said, "Don't know yet." She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded and looked back at her plate. It was not enough of an answer, and both of them knew it, but Frank had no more to give that night, and he did not know how to say so, and so he said nothing more at all. June came in without mercy. The creek feeding the south pasture dried completely in the first week. 3 cattle died in the second. Frank moved the remainder to the north grazing land along the river and began cutting the herd in his head, the way a man does when he is preparing himself for a loss he cannot yet measure.
He stopped talking at supper almost entirely. He answered questions. He did not volunteer. He came in from a land each evening with the particular exhaustion that is not just physical, the kind that sits behind the eyes and makes a man's face look like a door that has been shut from the inside. Rebecca kept the household running with a quiet tenacity that asked nothing of him. She kept the accounts. She kept the garden alive on pure stubbornness and well water. She did not complain. She did not push. But on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of June, she set her fork down and looked at him directly and said, "Frank, talk to me." He looked at the table. Nothing to say that would help. "I'm not asking for help," she said. "I'm asking to know what is happening with you." He said, "I'm fine." The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not the quiet of two people who had stopped needing words, the quiet of a wrong thing left standing. Rebecca folded her napkin, set it beside her plate, and went to the spare room. Not in anger, he could tell the difference, in a kind of resignation that was worse than anger. He sat at the table for a long time after. The lamp burned. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when something has gone slightly wrong inside them. Frank Doherty was a man who could hold a thing together through flood and freeze and financial ruin. What he had never learned, what 11 years alone had quietly untaught him, was how to let another person stand beside him while he did it. He understood, sitting at that table, that this was the thing that would cost him her, not the drought, him. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about what he had become in the space of 3 weeks. A man who had been given something real and had responded by going stone silent and calling it protection. He had been alone for 11 years and had told himself that was simply the shape of his life. But lying there in the dark, he understood the difference between a man who is alone because circumstance made him so, and a man who is alone because he will not open a door that someone is standing on the other side of, knocking. He got up before dawn. He made coffee. He sat with it in the dark kitchen, and he waited. She came out at first light. She stopped when she saw him. He stood up. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him steadily. "I go inside myself when things get hard," he said. "I've done it my whole life. I don't have a good reason for it, and I know it isn't fair to you." He stopped. "You asked to know what was happening with me, and you had every right to ask, and I gave you nothing. I'm sorry for that." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down and said, "Tell me now." He did, all of it. The cattle losses, the numbers, what the drought would likely take before the rains came, and what would be left after. He said it plain, without softening it, and she listened the way she always listened, all the way through, without flinching at any of it. Outside, Wade's wagon came up the gate road. He climbed down, looked at the dry creek bed, looked at the house, and walked to the door. When Frank opened it, Wade looked at him and then past him at Rebecca sitting at the table with the ledger open in front of her. Wade said, "You doing all right?" Frank said, "Getting there." Wade nodded slowly. He looked at Rebecca once more. He put his hat back on. "You need anything, you know where I am." He turned and went back to his wagon without another word. That was all, but it was enough.
The rains came in late August. Not gently. The hill country did not do gentle. A wall of weather came up from the southwest on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky going green-black above the granite ridge, and then the Llano River rose 6 feet overnight, and the rain came down so hard on the limestone roof that Frank and Rebecca had to raise their voices to hear each other across the kitchen table. They didn't go to bed. They sat up and listened to it, and Frank watched the river through the window and kept his own counsel about whether it would hold its banks. It held.
By morning, the South Pasture Creek was running again, thin but real, and the caliche yard had gone dark with moisture, and the air smelled the way hill country air smells after a long rain, cedar and limestone and something alive returning. Frank walked out into it alone at first light. He stood in the wet yard and looked at the running creek and the cattle moving to it, and the garden that Rebecca had kept alive by sheer will through 8 weeks of drought, showing its first new green in the morning light. He stood there for a long time. He was not a man who showed what moved through him. He had kept things close for so long that the habit had calcified into character, or so he had believed. But standing in that yard with the rain-cleaned air and the creek running and the knowledge of what they had just come through together, something in him gave way in a manner he had not expected and could not have predicted. Rebecca came out and stood beside him. She did not say anything about the creek or the garden or the rain. She looked at his face, which was doing something he could not control, and she simply reached out and put her hand through his arm and stood there. That was all. She did not make it into anything. She just stood beside him. He covered her hand with his, and they stood like that in the wet morning until he was steady again, until the thing that had let go settled into something he thought he might be able to carry better than before. He said quietly, "I couldn't have held it together without you." She said, "I know, same goes." Said it the way she said true things, plain, like a nail driven straight. No ceremony and no decoration, and absolutely no doubt. He believed her completely.
The years settled into the land the way limestone settles, slowly, with weight, and permanently. The ranch grew to nearly 200 acres. They took on a section to the north when the Ferris family moved to San Antonio, and the place ran with an order and rhythm that Frank could not separate into his contribution and hers. He tried more than once. He never could do it cleanly. She was as much a part of this holding as the stone barn was, as the Llano River was, as the cedar fence line he had built on instinct 20 years prior and had never once had cause to regret. The accounts stayed good. They were always good when Rebecca kept them. Wade married a woman from Fredericksburg the year after Frank and Rebecca's wedding, a sharp, lively woman named Harriet, who suited him in every way no designed arrangement ever could have achieved. They had 2 children who broke things with cheerful efficiency and made Wade look perpetually bewildered and quietly grateful, which was exactly the right way for Wade Doherty to look. He said to Frank once, leaning on the south gate with his hat pushed back and the Llano River moving behind them in the afternoon light, "You know I did you a favor." Frank said, "You did. Don't think I don't know it." Wade grinned. Frank didn't disagree. Whatever Wade meant by it, the truth of it was beyond question. The drought of that first year was not the last hard thing the land delivered. There were others, a flooding winter, a cattle sickness that took 24 head one bitter spring, a year when the prices fell so low that Frank sat at the kitchen table with the numbers spread before him and could not find a way through them until Rebecca sat down beside him and found it for him, plainly, without drama, the way she did most things. She was still doing it. She had never stopped. Every evening when the work was done and the light went gold across the river, Frank came up from the south pasture along the limestone path his own boots had worn into the caliche over the years, and he crested the small rise where the cedar broke open and the ranch house came into view. The kitchen window held a lamp, warm and steady against the darkening hill country sky. He had come home to that lamp for more years than he could count without feeling the full weight of his own good fortune. It did the same thing to him every single time. Something in his chest that had been held close since longer than he could reckon just let go. He went inside. He hung his coat on the peg by the door. She looked up from whatever she was doing and said something true, not a reassuring thing, a real thing. The kind a woman says to a man she has long since decided can handle the honest version and has never once seen reason to doubt it. He sat down, The warmth came in from the stove. The Llano River moved outside in the dark the way it had moved since long before either of them arrived on its banks, and would move long after they were gone. Sometimes she rested her hand briefly on his shoulder before going back to what she was doing. Just a rest, brief as a breath. That was the whole of it. Frank Doherty had come to that bend of the Llano River with his father's stubbornness and not much else. He had not planned for partnership or softness or the particular peace that comes from being known completely by someone who looked at the honest version of a man and chose without hesitation to stay. But Rebecca McPherson had traveled a long way on clear eyes and no illusions, and she had looked at this limestone country and this silent, weathered man and decided both were worth believing in. She had been right. She had been right about a good deal more than the land. If this story reached something in you, we would be honored to have you along for the ride. Every week on this channel, we bring you stories from the American frontier of hard ground, honest hearts, and the quiet, extraordinary courage it took to build a real life at the edge of the known world. Hit that subscribe button below. There will always be a story waiting for you here, and we will always leave a lamp in the window.